Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Alistair Currie, the Executive Director of Conservation Catalyst. And hopefully I think a lot of people are have joined us before, but for those of you that are new, this is Conservation Colloquy, and we are a transdisciplinary platform for holistically unraveling global problems between people and wildlife. So Wildlife Wednesday is a free webinar for wildlife professionals and students interested in wildlife coexistence. And these take place the first Wednesday of every month at the same time. For those of you that are new to Conservation Colloquy, you're in for a real treat. There's an innovative presentation by a world expert that is applicable to participants from around the world. Followed by an informal question and discussion session, which is my favorite part. So these are not only going to be live on Zoom, but also on Facebook Live, which I know many of you are joining us from, and recorded and posted on YouTube and on the Conservation Colloquy website. So we highlight interdisciplinary scientists that are conducting relevant research that will influence that, all biodiversity on the planet. And I recently read a report from Population Matters, and I was really impressed by the holistic approach it took. And so those of us working at this nexus between humans and biodiversity know that we, of course, are the problem, but we're also really aware that we are also the solutions, and we just need to kind of get better about thinking outside of the box and working with people from other disciplines. And so it's really with great honor that I introduce today's expert. So we're really lucky to have Alistair Currie joining us, and he is the head of campaigns and communications at Population Matters. And he's been a professional campaigner for more than 20 years for a diversity of different organizations. So I think he's going to share a lot of experience from Cruelty Free International, Free Tibet, and so diversity of both animal organizations and also human rights organizations. And so truly kind of bringing together, he works at that nexus of these issues, which is fantastic. So I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit more, Alistair, but please join me in welcoming Alistair to Conservation Colloquy Wildlife Wednesday.
Thanks very much, Alistair, and thanks very much for inviting us and that very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone for joining. As Alistair says, I'm a campaigner, not a scientist, but this is an area, biodiversity is an area we've been working in for quite some time, and it's one that particularly engages me. You may see a picture of behind me on the other side there. That's a baby humpback whale. And animal issues, both animal rights and conservation, environmental issues have long been close to my heart. And one of the joys about working for Population Matters is that I'm able to combine, just as Alistair said, interest in human rights, in international development and animal issues. So I've got a lot of data in this presentation, but hopefully you can cope with it as scientists, but hopefully, but I have just one slide, which I think is all words, and it's the one coming up, because I should tell you a little bit more about Population Matters. So this is our official vision. You don't have to read it all, but this is our statement. So our vision is for a future in which our population coexists in harmony with nature and prosper on a healthy planet to the benefit of all. And we obviously belong to the group, which I'm sure you all belong to, who recognize that there is no prospering for human beings unless we have a healthy planet to live on. And it's our belief and conviction that one of the contributions to our environmental problems is our population growth and level of population, along with many other issues, and that there are positive solutions to it. And that's what I'll talk about more as we go on. So we're a UK-based charity. We've been going for about 30 years, and our main areas of work are campaigning, so campaigning for policy changes, And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Informing is really important to what we do, not just in occasions like this, but there are a lot of, there's a lot of curiosity about population. There's also a lot of for want of a better word, ignorance about its contribution and what's happening with it. So we think it's very important to put the information in front of people. And as part of that, we do research. We haven't done primary research recently, though we have a very exciting piece coming up before too long, but it's going to take about a year before it emerges. Most of our research tends to be, at the moment, it tends to be collecting primary sources and collating them. And then the other thing that we do is empower. Now, we believe that campaigning and informing people is all about empowerment, but we also very specifically work with, on a small scale, with grassroots organizations who are involved in solutions to population issues, family planning, women's empowerment, that sort of thing, which we'll talk about later. And we work with them to help introduce those solutions, help them rather to finance those solutions. And they really are a brilliant model of how it works, of the things that we can do. We are very fortunate in our patrons, and particularly in having Sir David Attenborough, who certainly in the UK is revered as a god, and in many other places is very well known. So our patrons include Sir David, Jane Goodall, and Chris Packham, who may not be known to many of you who are outside the UK, but he's a well-known naturalist and broadcaster here. We also have an expert advisory group of about a dozen people with expertise in various different areas, and we have 3 people closely involved in biology on that who are named here: Dr. Mutari Amino-Kano, Edu Effiong, and Fred Naggs. So again, this is a resource that we consult when we are talking about issues of relevance here, and we're very fortunate to have that group. As far as our memberships go, we recently became members of the IUCN, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Also of IPBS, and the Climate Coalition is a UK-based climate campaign coalition, as you might imagine. And I should at this point introduce Bigfoot. You'll have seen him on my initial slide. Bigfoot is a sculpture which we commissioned about 4 years ago now. The disappointing thing about Bigfoot is that pictures don't do him justice. He could be 6 inches high in this picture. He is in fact about 6 feet high. And if you look closely, what you can see is that he's a metal sculpture, and he's standing on the earth, which is being squashed. And if you look very closely, you can see that what he's actually made of is metal imprints of babies. Now, I should say straight away, we are not anti-baby, we are not anti-natalist, we are not anti-parent, we are not anti-child. I'm a parent myself. But Bigfoot is a way of illustrating the issue. And what's really interesting is when we take Bigfoot out on the street, everyone gets it. People look at it and say, of course, it's about large numbers of people standing on the earth and making the impact that we do. And it really is remarkable. Very few people have any objections to it, and they just understand it. And I think it shows the sort of intuitive understanding that people have of this issue. And Bigfoot is at the heart of our Anthropocene campaign. And as part of our interest in this, in 2019, we held a public conference in London called The Last Elephant in the Room, looking specifically at the link between human population and the 6th mass extinction, which was a really fascinating conference, very well attended. We had a great lineup of speakers, and really was very much at the first sort of public event that we had in our growing work on biodiversity, which is an area where we particularly wanted to get involved in the policy issues. And just to start off with a couple of things, these are graphics that we shared at the conference, and they're ones that many of you will be familiar with, and that we find really resonate with people. This one on weight of vertebrate land animals, this has been used most recently in WWF's Living Planet report. In fact, since we commissioned this graphic, the estimate of figures have become a little bit more precise, and it's now thought to be that there are still 4% of the land mass of vertebrate, the mass weight of vertebrate animals are wild animals, not 1% as we have it here, but really the difference is pretty marginal. The incredible change in the composition of vertebrate animal mass in the last 10,000 years, effectively human civilization, is quite astonishing. And the other graphic that we regularly share on this is a little bit out of date, in fact, because those of you who've seen the most recent Living Planet report and index will know that the figure has now gone up to, I think, 64 or 65% of wild vertebrate animal populations lost. But of course, and again, there is a sort of intuitive understanding here that population growth, increasing the numbers of us and decreasing the number of animals are associated. But of course, association doesn't prove causation. So I want to start, before I go on to the other things, just being really clear that about the fact that human population growth is a factor that contributes to and is a leading cause of biodiversity loss is actually not something that there is any really room for discussion. In fact, there's general consensus on that. So I'm just going to give a handful of references to it. The first, one of the most important and influential assessments that's taken place in recent years, the IPBES Global Assessment done in 2019, identifies human population very clearly. It describes human population dynamics and trends as being one of the indirect drivers of change. And it talks with, I could have extracted other quotes from the report, but these are a couple that address that. And in particular, it talks about, in the second quote there, about change over the coming decades and changes arising from continued human population growth. And of course, this mentions here increasing purchasing power, increasing per capita consumption. And it's very important for me to say at the outset that I'm here to talk about population, but it doesn't mean that we don't think that other things are important. And clearly, per capita consumption is very, very significant here. So it's not just about the numbers of people; it's the way we behave, but it's also about the numbers of people. Next, Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, published just very recently, as I'm sure you all know, again, clearly identifies the pressures, the direct pressures, which are on wildlife, driven by currently unsustainable patterns of production, consumption, and population growth. Next example, Living Planet report, again, which only came out a short while ago. In practically the first few sentences, it talks about human population growth, again, in that context of consumption, global trade, etc. And then another one I just wanted to highlight, I hope that many of you are aware of this, but it hasn't had much profile recently. The paper published in 2017, World Scientists Warning to Humanity, a second notice, which followed on from a notice originally in 1992. This was signed by, at the time, more than 15,000 scientists. I think the number is around about 20,000 just now. And again, this summary of our environmental crisis and call for action talks about rapid population growth and also identifies some of the solutions. Those are some of the main ones that I wanted to identify, but there is no shortage of individual papers on this issue. These are news stories from our own website here. Each one of them links to an original study, which there are far more, but they're just an example. And I should say our website covers a multitude of different areas: women's rights, population itself. So we only cover biodiversity specifically every now and then, but these are just a few. And you can also read the headlines there of papers that do that. But thankfully, there is now a fantastic resource looking at these things, which was only published a little while ago. And some of you may be aware of the Center for Biological Diversity, which is a US-based organization. And they recently, just in the last 3 months, I think, published this Crowded Planet database, which is a resource, a database of, well, as it says, about human population pressures on the environment. It's a database of papers. It's a really absolutely fantastic resource if you want to explore this further, crowdedplanet.org, as you can see. So the evidence is really incontrovertible, and there's general consensus, really widespread consensus, that human population growth has contributed to biodiversity loss and will continue to do so. So let's look at a picture on population, fill in on that. Many of you may be familiar with this curve here. human population stayed very flat for a long time. There weren't 1 billion people alive at any one time on the earth until around about the time of Napoleon, about 200 years ago. And over the 20th century, population rocketed. I'm 57, the population has more than doubled in my lifetime. And we continue to add 80 million people a year. But obviously a long-term trend like that doesn't show us what's going to happen in the future. So let's look at that. These are the most recent United Nations projections on population growth. Looking at that period, obviously you can see the hard line there is taking us up to the latest data. We're currently at about 7.8 billion people on the Earth. And then those are the projections that follow on from that. So you see that the projection is just under 10 million for 2050, and it's a little bit under 11 billion for 2100. Obviously, the further in advance projections go, the less reliable they become. But as you can see, that this does map the 95% certainty range, and there's another graph that I'll show you later on that looks in a little bit more detail. So one of the first things to say is there's a lot of talk, which we'll talk about a belief that population growth is flattening out. In fact, what the United Nations says is that there's only a 1 in 4 chance of population plateauing by the end of this century. So there's a 75% chance that we're still going to be growing at that point. Now, you know, as you can see, this curve basically is flattening by the end of the century, and there is a lot of uncertainty about the future. But nevertheless, don't believe people tell you it's plateauing, which we'll go back to in a moment. And just because people tend to find these things very interesting, it's looking at what our most popular. This is looking at our most populous country. This is from the UN data and the projections about what's going to happen there. You'll see, for instance, that India is due to overtake China as the world's largest country before too long. Generally pretty stable in most other places, but one of the ones to highlight is also Nigeria at the bottom. They're projected to take over from the US as the 3rd largest country within a generation. And if things continue as they are, to become a country of nearly 800 million people by the end of the century, if things continue as they are, and that's obviously something that we'll talk about. And I referred to sort of what's being said about, or what's often said about population growth and population projections. And there's been a little bit of a cottage industry of dismissing or challenging the United Nations projections. Recently, there's this book that came out a little while ago, Empty Planet, and just back in August, there was a story that received huge attention, certainly in the UK, based on a study that was published in The Lancet, and which originally came from a US university. I'm sorry, I can't remember which off the top of my head, talking about decline in fertility rates. It initially described one column as a jaw-dropping crash in children being born. So let's be clear, I'll go on through for this. This same study projects that we will still have 2 billion extra people over the next 30 years. Over a longer period, it shows that plateauing and reduction that the UN does, but coming sooner. But this is not, our population is about to plateau and our population is about to go down. We're talking about 2 billion more mouths to feed, 2 billion more people requiring infrastructure, energy, etc. The reason that this particular study projected that the population would peak sooner is because it was based on some assumptions about future trends in family planning and the like, which I'll also talk about. But they were pretty optimistic projections. It could happen. It absolutely could happen. But there's reason to be skeptical about this one. But you can see what's important in thinking about, obviously, population is a product of longevity and primarily of longevity and fertility rates. Fertility rate means essentially the average number of children that a woman will have in her lifetime. It doesn't refer to medical fertility, infertility, and it's a sort of proxy for family size. And if you look at this, you'll see that although for unique reasons, China's fertility is expected to increase slightly, everywhere else in the world, fertility rates going down, and that's been the pattern for the last 50 years. There's only one country in the world, Democratic Republic of Congo, where where fertility rate is actually higher than it was a little while ago. But everywhere across the world, fertility rate is going down, which is very, very good news. And we'll talk partly about why it's good news later on. So that's the trend. But what we believe is that trend, the quicker that trend goes forward, then the more our environment's going to be protected, and biodiversity, and we'll talk about the reasons that may happen. And this is a really critical slide here. This also is United Nations projections, and what it shows is what would happen if the middle blue line is the standard United Nations projection. What would happen if it got fertility rates wrong by half a child, if there were half a child more or less? So on average, roughly speaking, in every second family, one more child than expected or one less child than expected. And you see the enormous difference that makes over a period of time. We're looking at potentially 16 billion people, more than double that we have now by 2100, or a smaller population than we have today. Now, these aren't projections, these are illustrations, but what they show is very small changes in fertility over time have a really significant change in population over time. And that's a really important message to take. So when we looked at these curves, small interventions can make a big difference, which I'll come back to. Why does population matter? I'm not going to tell you a lot of things that you already know, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with global footprint networks work and the issue of resource use and renewable resource use. And this again was featured, GFN's work was featured in the Living Planet report very recently. And we're very pleased and proud that the director of Global Footprint Network is also on our expert advisory committee. We're using more than the Earth can provide, or rather that the Earth can renew at the moment, and it's going to get worse. And then when we look at the human footprint, again, many of you will be familiar with these kinds of figures. The curve, as I tend to say, which you'll be familiar with, when you look at any curve related to human activity, it goes up. If you look at anything related to the natural world, biodiversity, it tends to go down. That's a generalization, but I'm sure it's one you're all familiar with. But I referred earlier on to talking about consumption and the other factors there. And in any discussion about consumption, I also showed big differences in fertility rate early on. But when we talk about consumption, it's obviously very important to recognize there's a huge difference in the impact of different countries. And this is GFN. Again, they were looking at how many Earths will be needed if everyone lived like the average X or whatever. We see the USA, unsurprisingly, sadly coming out very badly on that, but my own country, the UK, doesn't do too well on that score either. And these vast inequity in consumption and impact is obviously deeply significant, though, as we'll also touch upon, it's not just affluence that causes environmental problems. Poverty also contributes to environmental problems. But in all of these, we must always recognize that this, and what you see, I do have set slides which are out of date, which I'm not showing, is obviously Niger, the country at the bottom here, has the highest fertility rate in the world, and it's an inverse relationship between those things: greater impact, lower fertility rate normally. So I just want to go on to talk briefly. Many of you will be very familiar with these things, obviously, about the threats and how population contributes to those. This is from the previous Living Planet report, but it's a way of identifying the main threats we're all aware of: habitat degradation, exploitation, invasive species pollution, and climate change. And population growth, human population growth has an impact on all of those. The most obvious is, excuse me, habitat loss and exploitation. Sorry, excuse me. And you'll see number of figures here, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these and may have many more you could add to this. But habitat loss, obviously very critical, and one of the primary drivers of that, as acknowledged here, is agriculture. Of course, we also see other problems: infrastructure, obviously urbanization, but also infrastructure in terms of roads and the like. there's a study a little while ago when you've seen about fragmentation of tiger habitats, and it is the fragmentation, it's roads and that sort of thing that's contributing to that. So it's not just about agriculture, but it is one of the fundamentals when we're talking about population growth, because people need to be fed. There are deep inequities in the way that we consume the things that we have. Everyone needs to be fed. Everyone needs water. Everyone needs land. And there's been a couple of significant reports on this recently, looking at how we can feed. We can feed everyone that we have on the planet at the moment. The fact that anyone goes hungry is a scandal. And the scandal is underrating it considerably. We have got capacity to feed everyone, and overpopulation does not cause famine. Circumstances cause famine, usually conflict. But the question is not whether we can feed everyone. The question is whether or not we can feed anyone without destroying the planet in the process. And one of the recent reports was this on the World Resources Institute, and looking at the food gap, how much more food we need to produce by 2050. It's an enormous amount, and it's very explicit here that our population growth is one of the core drivers of that. Oh, sorry, I seem to have stopped sharing my screen. Let me just go back to this. Sorry, bear with me. Hopefully, you can all see this. And the World Resources Institute, one of the, it's what we call its menu of solutions, was to reduce growth in demand. Its population is about the demand side, and at the bottom of this extract from it says achieve replacement level fertility rates, encourage voluntary reductions in fertility by educating girls, reducing child mortality, and providing access to reproductive health services. And we'll talk about those solutions some more. Replacement rate fertility is under 2.1 children per woman, for in the obvious sense that when two people produce kids, if you have two or less, then they're only replacing one another. They aren't contributing to population growth, though it takes a while for that to happen for reasons which I don't need to go into just now. But that was explicitly one of their calls. And then there was another report, the Lancet report, that came out a couple of years ago and was updated again recently, and the very authoritative report involving hundreds of researchers. But this is what the 2019 version said. Healthy diets from sustainable food systems are possible for up to 10 billion people, but become increasingly unlikely past this population threshold. Well, our population is currently projected to go past 10 billion, and something which is really critical about both the World Resources Institute and the Eat Lancet report is they said, in order to achieve this, we need to transform the way that we produce food, the way we distribute it, the way we consume it. Plant-based diets came up a lot, but what they're saying is we can only do this, we can only feed up to 10 billion people if we make incredibly large changes. But even if we do that, it becomes increasingly likely past this population threshold. So the pressure to feed people, to provide people is really very hugely significant when we're looking at biodiversity loss and environmental damage generally. I won't go into as much detail about other issues, but I did just want to highlight pollution, which we know is a driver, briefly, and plastic pollution. And part of the reason for this slide is to highlight something which, again, I think people know certainly, which is that environmental destruction can also be a product of poverty as well as of affluence. You look at where many of these, a lot of these rivers which are supplying, which are responsible for a large amount of plastic pollution, and some of them come from very poor places, and the notion of both population and a less than ideal waste management process might not be a result of poverty, but often is. And of course, when we look at, although I won't talk about it much now, things like deforestation, desertification, those can often be caused by people living in poverty who have no choice about their their supplies of food, obviously bushmeat as well, as supplies of food or fuel, or the way that they are forced to graze. So climate change, we also obviously all recognise as a driver of biodiversity loss. And again, although we know that, as we'll look at, this is disproportionately a problem caused by the wealthy, population growth is relevant to it. And this slide really looks at this important distinction. These are consumption emissions, i.e. things which are produced in order to serve the market within a territory are included in its emissions rather than simply the emissions that are produced on its territory. And the graph on the right there looks at the capital emissions per person, and there's no big surprises there to see North America, particularly the USA and Australia, highlighted in red as being hugely significant in there, and to see there there are places with no data or very little, or very often some of the poorest countries, because that's the association. If we look at CO2 consumption emissions per country, though, it looks slightly different, and what you see there amongst the reds are India and China. Now, there's more than one reason for that. Partly it's to do with, particularly in India, their reliance on coal, but it's also to do, of course, with their massive populations. And something that's very important to focus on when thinking about climate emissions is, it's rightly said that the contribution of Africa and much of the global south to climate emissions is absolutely negligible, and it is. But the only reason the main reason it is negligible is because people live in poverty, because these are poor countries. And when they do, as they must, as every human has a right to, increase their affluence, so their emissions will go up as well. So yes, it doesn't matter now. And this is not remotely about blaming anyone or pointing fingers, certainly not at the global south. Fingers need to be pointed at the global north in those circumstances. But we can only address climate change in the longer term if we recognise that people will get richer. And if the example is Nigeria, which I showed earlier on, looking at tripling its population. There, if Nigeria assumes a greater degree of affluence, the climate impact of that could be very significant. And just within the developed world, I'll just go over this very quickly. There was some research done a little while ago which looked at possible actions individuals can take. And what it found was that, if you can see the graph on the left, is that it's hugely greater impact can be taken by choosing to have one fewer child. That's the big block there than any of the other common actions, such as going car-free or changing diet. It should be said, though, that this research is a little bit, or looking at the results, it can be a little bit misleading. That is over the long term that you get the benefits from having one fewer child. It's not an immediate benefit. So the graphic on the right is looking at so just checking the time there, sorry, is looking at what in the situation in the UK, our consumption emissions in the UK. So it's a fairly simplistic way of looking at it, but it illustrates that if a person is responsible for 11.9 tonnes, then it's still remarkably more effective as a choice in terms of addressing it. But of course, none of this means that the other things should be ignored. We're never proposing population as the only solution to any problem. It's a part of the menu of solutions. And very importantly, a research that was done by Project Drawdown in 2017, again, very authoritative research, looked at what are the available solutions to climate change right now. Not things which require future technology or other changes. And it found that women's empowerment, family planning and educating girls had the greatest effect in bringing emissions down by 2050 because of its effect on population, essentially. Now, I should say this is a slightly old graphic. Drawdown have revised their figures in 2019, and actually these two elements come slightly lower. Then they're now combined on the second highest contributor or potential contributor underneath food waste, I think, as I recall, but we haven't updated our graphic yet, but we will be doing that soon. But it's illustrative of just how important population is as a solution to climate change. And I think in terms of looking at the importance of these solutions, this quote from IPBES Global Assessment is so important, that we can look at the direct drivers like habitat loss, but we can't achieve protection of nature without transformative change that simultaneously addresses the indirect drivers. Population growth is an indirect driver explicitly recognized by IPBES and elsewhere, and many other places, as I showed at the beginning. So solutions. This is the good news. And one of the things we find is that people often feel when it comes to population that it's not a thing we need to address because one, it's going to sort itself out, and we've looked at that. And the second is there aren't any good solutions to it. Well, there are. The solutions are all positive. And they're listed here. It's really simple. Global justice, lift people out of poverty. Poor people have more kids for a number of reasons. Partly it's because people live in very poor places, have higher child mortality, and so tend to have more children. But also, if you're poor and in a rural area, having more kids makes sense. It's a sense of labour, and in particular, if you live somewhere where you cannot rely on the government to look after you, there's no social or governmental safety net. Having kids is a safety net. You lift people out of poverty, they don't feel the need to have more kids, and you see that constantly. Empowering women and girls could not be more significant when it comes to population reduction, where women have got education, have got power over their economic independence, they have fewer kids. Up to a certain point, when you reach a high level of affluence, then you see that curve changing. But at the moment, very few people live at that level of affluence. Education is particularly crucial to that, but all forms of women's empowerment. Modern family planning, you can do everything else, but unless people can access and freely use effective modern contraception, they can't control or make choices about the number of children that they have. So it's absolutely fundamental. Currently in the world, 270 million women who have an unmet need for family planning. They would like not to be pregnant, but they aren't using family planning. And there are various reasons for that. It's not all about access at all. It's not all about them not actually being able to get things. But shockingly, that number is actually going up. That since over the last 25 years, the number of women, the proportion of women using modern family planning has only gone up by 6%. And one of the reasons why it's going, or not one of the reasons, the reason it's going up is population growth. Although we're actually getting better at delivering family planning, the uptake of family planning, population growth is outstripping it, particularly in places where family planning is most needed. So that number is set to go up, which is really astonishing. There will be more women unless we do something with an unmet need for family planning in the future. And one of the things to really recognize, I don't dwell on it in this presentation because there's a lot to get to, but globally family planning is under huge pressure at the moment. There is not enough money in family planning. There are a number of reasons for that. The current administration, obviously we'll see whether it's still the administration in the US in a few days' time, or maybe later today, has introduced the global gag rule, which effectively prevents US family planning aid going to any organization that is involved in any way or even talks about abortion. That's had a massive effect. There is less aid going into this area. And now a new threat as a result of COVID is that both aid budgets, and in particular domestic budgets in places where people are poor, but also elsewhere, that money is being diverted to other health needs at that point. Another impact of coronavirus is challenging moving people out of poverty. The UN estimates that 70 million people are going to be made poor by COVID, and we know that poverty has an impact as well, so it's very important. And then the last sort of element in addressing population is promoting small families and people choosing small families. And it's vital to stress, all about choice. And the context for this is, which you'll be familiar with from a biodiversity point of view, is the Sustainable Development Goals. The things that we need to do: no poverty, good health and well-being, including contraceptive access, quality education, particularly for girls, gender equality, reducing inequalities. All these things bring down population growth and fertility rates. They're all good things. Why wouldn't we be doing them anyway? Or we're not doing enough of them at the moment. But these are the positive solutions that we have. And places which have introduced those kinds of solutions have done spectacularly well in bringing down their fertility rates and bringing down their family size. You can see some examples here. And as I said, everywhere in the world it's going down, but the curve is flattening in a lot of places. And if you look at the graph on the right, I don't have it on here, but if you were to overlay the curve of China on here, in terms of its fertility rates, it wouldn't look very different. China's coercive one-child policy wasn't more successful than the actions that were taken, the voluntary choice-based actions that we've talked about in a lot of other countries, as well, of course, as being a completely unacceptable abuse of human rights, the one-child policy. It is a human right identified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for people to have a family and choose how big it is. And no one is talking about interfering with that right. It is about providing people the options and the choices. And then, particularly for those of us who are in the developed world, who are not in poverty, who have access to family planning, where women are at least more empowered than elsewhere, we can exercise that choice as individuals. That's a picture of Gregory and his daughter talking about his reasons for it. And this is one of Population Matters' core messaging, is that we can and should, that we can exercise that choice, and we'll be living on a healthier planet if we do. And I remind you again of the graph that I shared earlier about how very small changes in fertility make a big difference to outcomes. So I want to just talk, and I'm kind of aware that I'm using up a lot of time here, a couple of more specific biodiversity solutions. And one is a population health environment model, which I would imagine that some of you are familiar with, but essentially it's a principle that obviously where pressures exist on local biodiversity or whatever, then can you look at the human pressures that are contributing to that? And those can be poverty, they can be health problems, they can be local population growth. And this is a model of addressing conservation that looks at how can you address those, and part of a key component of that is the provision of family planning. And these organizations identified here are all involved in providing, they are conservation organizations which provide family planning or enable family planning and women's empowerment and the like. And I know obviously Alitra has got a particular interest in human wildlife conflict, Cheetah Conservation Fund, talking about that here. In fact, I think this is in Namibia, and you may know more about it. Litris. Again, some more examples here. You don't need to read the entire quotes, because I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And what I very much wanted to highlight was the Thriving Together initiative. A core organisation is the Margaret Pike Trust, a very small UK-based family planning organisation, but they pay a great deal of attention to this and wrote an excellent report. That's the cover of it last year, looking about the value of removing those barriers to family planning, which is so important. Remember, 270 million women not able to use or not currently using family planning. They produced this excellent report, and an alliance of organisations with an interest both in family planning and in conservation, about 150 of them, called Thriving Together. Do have a look at their website. And in literally news that came out in the last few hours, one of the things that Margaret Pike has done as part of the Thriving Together is to put a motion to the IUCN talking specifically about this. This is an extract from that motion. Importance of for the conservation of nature of removing barriers to rights-based voluntary family planning. That motion was voted on in October and passed, I learned about 2.5 hours ago, when results from the things came through the IUCN. So this is really excellent news that there was a very healthy majority in support of this. I don't know exactly what the next stages will be for that now, but that's really an excellent result, and great work that Margaret Pike have done in highlighting this issue and seeing that there is real support for it amongst the conservation community. So just to touch quickly on other solutions, we've talked about the population solutions, the things that need to happen. How can we relate those to biodiversity? Well, one of the key ways is through the Convention on Biological Diversity and the new post-2020 global framework, which I'm sure many or all of you are familiar with, which is being worked on just now. We've been doing work for some time to try and promote the notion that these voluntary population solutions, like Margaret Pike are talking about, form part of the picture of solutions, and that the new language in the global biodiversity framework should reflect that. And so that when countries are doing their national biodiversity action plans, if they include things like family planning, women's empowerment, and recognize the value of those things, that both enhances the amount of money that might go into them and makes this contribution to protecting biodiversity. That train has rolled on. It's been, as you'll know, that the global the post-2020 framework has been delayed by COVID, which we'll have to see what emerges from that. But that's work that we are doing. Also, the IPBS talked about transformative change earlier on. It has currently got a transformative change assessment, quite a long process. I think it's 2 or 3 years. A colleague of mine has been working on that. We made contribution to it. We talked about the need for transformative change, and work is going on in that area. Excuse me. And as you'll know, there was a UN Summit on Biodiversity at the end of September, which looked at this, and the pledge referred to here wasn't from directly as a result of that. It was done in advance by a number of countries, including the UK, the EU, and many countries in the global south, which asked for the post-2020 framework to include commitments to address direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. Keep emphasizing this: human population growth is an indirect driver of biodiversity loss. There is a recognition of the need to address these things, but there isn't currently work being done to include that in human population growth. So one of our jobs, Population Matters, is to say, look, you're saying you recognize this is a recognized contributor, and you're saying you'll address it. So let's look at these positive solutions which are there. So in 2018 at the COP climate change meeting that took place there, our patron David Attenborough spoke, and he laid it on the line at that point. And I think he was talking about climate change in this context, but I think any of us involved in this area are probably at least as frightened by biodiversity loss as we are by climate change, and the threat that it poses to us, as well as obviously the threat it poses to the natural world. And it's my belief that what he said is true, that unless we take action, then that really is what we're facing. Human beings are resilient, but there's only so much we can do when our biosphere is suffering so much. And you will do this too, I'm sure, but as part of my job, I'm a generalist. I'm not a scientist. Biodiversity isn't my only interest. Across my desk, regularly come environmental reports of one kind or another about food, about climate change, about multiple things. And what I've noticed in the last couple of years is there are 2 words that recur over and over again in these major reports. The first, worryingly, is this one, that the changes that we're facing catastrophe unless we do something. And the second one is this one, transformation. That word transformative comes up over and over again, that the solutions, that the things that we need to do are fundamental in order to prevent ecological collapse in every respect, in every area. Well, when it comes to population, actually we don't need to transform. As I showed earlier on, our fertility rates are coming down pretty much everywhere. This is a trend that's happening. It's a positive trend that's happening. It's a good thing that fertility rates are coming down, and I haven't had time to talk about it, but it's certainly not a problem in the developed world, particularly given our consumption impact. So we don't actually need transformation in this area. What we need is solutions that we already know, the positive solutions that improve people's lives, that we put more effort into doing these, as well as all the other changes we made. Addressing population is not going to solve our environmental problems, but it's a vital component of them. And I'll leave you with a quote from our patron again. And really, I don't need to show these 45 slides that I've shown today. This, to me, it says everything that needs to be said. It is so self-evidently true. All our environmental problems become easier to solve with fewer people, and harder, ultimately impossible to solve with ever more people. It is a solvable problem. It's a real problem, but it is one we can solve if we put the effort into it. Thank you very much. And I leave you with this last slide, which has my contact details on. If you wanted to get in contact with me, though obviously I take questions just now, and obviously one of the most important messages that I think we need all to take on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Well, wow, that was really great. A really broad perspective on so much of this. I was wondering if we could just start. Alistair, you've had such a diverse career. You spent so much time campaigning. What advice do you have for those of us, working with people who have different perspectives, and kind of reaching across the aisle, so to speak,
Yeah.
About these issues?
Yeah. I mean, it's the, most people know it, but it's essential rule with all communication: audience, audience, audience. What are their interests? Where is the common ground? That's always a critical thing. Where are you closest together? And you concentrate on the areas where you're closest together instead of the areas where you're furthest apart. And it can be the hardest thing to do, but always thinking about what it is that they need, what their interests are, and offering people solutions. That's the thing. You can go into people and telling them what the problems are. They may already know. Sometimes you need to tell them what the problems are. I find in my current job, when I used to work at Free Tibet, as we talked about. Free Tibet has the best name in the world. It tells you what the problem is, and it tells you what the solution is right there in it. Don't get me started on it, but China occupying another country is a gross injustice, and there's a simple solution when it comes to population. We do need to explain. We do need to provide data, and sometimes, obviously, that can be very important, but it's always about the audience. It's always thinking about what they need and how you can bridge any gap that exists between you.
And I might just, everyone, please feel free to either unmute yourself and ask a question or post a question. I have some questions coming in from Facebook. If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and read some of the stuff. So you mentioned people changing their daily routines to lower their own carbon footprint. Is there some research that people are doing that, and is that enough to impact the CO2 emission levels? Or do you know of any policy changes? And what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, well, again, I think you go back to the sort of the last slides I talked about transformation, and that's what we need but we shouldn't underrate that it is us that buys the stuff. It is us who consumes the unhealthy food or takes the flights, and changing our behavior is important. But of course, we need change at a much higher level. But one thing I think I think is very important when we talk about political change and getting policymakers to change is that policymakers, if you conduct a poll, everyone says stop climate change. Everyone says protect the environment. What politicians want to know is how much do they really care about that? And one way that we show politicians that we care is we change our behavior. And you see that in lots of different sort of different movements and effects. And if they're seeing that we are as an increasing number of us are doing, for instance, changing our diets and eating a more plant-based diet, then suddenly they feel both sort of more motivated, but also less frightened of introducing changes that are needed. So personally, I feel I have to do these things. I'm sure most people watching do, but of course they're not enough. But I think you should recognize we need systems change, we need transformative change, we need political change. But one of the things we can do to help achieve that is make sure that people know that we are changing.
Another question that came in, is it possible to truly incentivize having less children per family on a global scale?
Well, I think in very large case, it doesn't need incentivized. For many people across the world, they not incentivized, but you provide the right circumstances for them, and they will simply choose to have smaller families. And those are the things that we talked about: empowering women, education, ending poverty, all those kinds of things. And we know that will change. The quicker that we make those change, we introduce those policies and those changes, the quicker it will come down. So you don't have to incentivize, up to a certain level. I think when it comes to people like us, you know, I mean, I don't know who's watching this, where they're from, but people like you and I who live in highly developed countries, you know, where we do have a lot of freedom of choice, then obviously we have the freedom of choice because those other things are sorted out. We have empowerment. We're not poor. Then there is potentially a role for positive incentives to people. Make the choice to have fewer children or to go child-free is one that benefits other people. You know, it's a positive choice in that way. So I think in principle, the notion of government incentivizing, say through tax breaks, you know, or something like that is I think a sensible one. But incentivization is a really, really difficult, you know, thing to do without having unintended consequences. So obviously, part of what we do is we talk about the need and the importance of it. And one thing I'm very conscious of, you see, my background was in animal rights campaigning. I've been a vegan for 26 years, and for the first 20 of those years, the number of vegans in the UK and in most other places did not change at all. In the last 5 years, it has zoomed up. You know, like that, because people have recognized actually that the impact that what they eat has an impact, you know, on the world, which people like me were saying for a very long time, but we sort of reached a point at which people understood that. And what we hope is the conversation about family size. People used to say, don't tell me what to eat. Yeah, and now people understand it's not about telling you what to do. It's about providing you information and making choices. The size of family that we have is another one of those things that affects other people. It affects our environment. It should be part of the conversation and our thinking when we think about family size.
Great point. I love the slogan, every choice matters. That's just such a great philosophy here to kind of have in your head all the time, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting. We worked with someone else, a communication specialist, and he gave that to us. And the minute he unveiled it, we thought that's absolutely the one. It was so perfectly encapsulated what we're about.
Yeah, it really is wonderful. It's really fantastic. Okay, we have another great question from Neil. He asks, do you have any thoughts on E.O. Wilson's Half Earth project as a viable path to addressing some of the ecological devastation caused by our population growth?
Well, it's interesting actually. On one version of the presentation I just gave, I refer to Half Earth, but I took it out just for there's a version of the presentation I give to sort of, you know, non-experts, not people like you, in which I talk about Half Earth. I'm not sufficiently expert in biodiversity to really be able to make a judgment on that. But it does seem like a rational solution. I certainly know that when you look at things like marine protected areas, they can have other benefits, but you'll all be more expert on me than that. But of course, it is a critical thing to say. If we're going to give half the Earth, you know, over to the natural world, the number of us, it makes a huge difference to that. We do all need energy. We do all need infrastructure. We do all need land. We do all need food. We do all need stuff. And if we're cramming that into half the world, remember the fact, I can't remember which report it's in now, but that 85% of the land surface of the Earth is touched by human hand in some way. It may be minimal, but there is some sort of human impact on it. And we think about wilderness and it doesn't seem to make sense, but that's the reality. So if we're going to shrink that territory, one of the things that we have to do is address population as well.
Great. Another question came in asking about the impacts of the Belts and Roads Initiative and your thoughts on the repercussions on human population growth, on top of this, already catastrophic, environmental devastation.
It's not an area on which I've got expertise. As a former Tibet campaigner, I'm no friend to anything. I shouldn't say I'm critical of everything the Chinese government does. The Chinese government does do some good things, but certainly its drive for economic growth has very negative consequences. So I'm not really expert enough to answer that question, but any kind of major, both infrastructure and trade and consumption development like that would be a cause for concern. And then
another question, clearly your passion really comes through about these topics, and I think kind of maybe piggybacking on what we first talked about, you know, how do we become most effective at doing this? You know, I think so many of us are working either locally, you know, where we're from, or, you know, in other places where we're working. You know, we go there, you know, to work with wildlife, or to, you know, help, you know, research or conserve wildlife in these areas. You know, it's impossible to, you know, not to do that and have, you know, interactions and grow these, you know, foster these relationships with local people.
Yeah.
And you know, how do we make things better, you know, on these issues, you know, and
I mean, it's obviously, you know, when it comes to these areas, it's incredibly important, obviously, to be culturally sensitive. You know, we talked about replacement rate fertility in most of the global north. We're below replacement rate fertility, where people are having fewer than 2 kids. There's many places in the earth where people are having more or a lot more, and that's currently a cultural norm there. So you know, if we're working with people who are from a different culture or in a different place, we've always got to be respectful of that and recognize what the circumstances are. But again, you know, there is an appetite for all these good things: family planning, women's empowerment, you know, all those kinds of things. So again, we're talking about where we have, you know, where we have things in common. Certainly, specifically, you know, the PHE, population health environment model of you know, of conservation is a really interesting one. You can go out there and Google it. There's a PHE network out there. It's not work that we're directly involved in, but certainly I would say, and so obviously there's lots of projects taking place in lots of countries, you know, which are looking at these issues directly. So as conservationists, as people engaged, I'd certainly recommend doing that. And I should also just flag, I mentioned the Centre for Biological Diversity. I'm not sure who are an entirely US-based organisation, and they've got a terrific population team there, and really do some excellent work. One of the really great things they do is they have condoms, and the packets. So I wish I should have had a look at one of these now, but they have sort of witty little poems, 2-liners about think of the animals when you get it on, or words to that effect. Very, really good, you know, good communication. So yeah, it's always got to be sensitive to the area that you're in, but certainly there are these models that exist in the population health environment, which I urge anyone who's actually actively involved in conservation, you know, to have a look at.
Yeah, I just, you know, a little, you know, anecdote from my work in Namibia. You know, there was a woman, you know, where I work, it's close to a full day's drive to into the clinic. So, you know, obviously very few options for, you know, family planning. Yeah. And you know, when I would go into town, people would always ask, you know, all these, you know, one woman asked, you know, may I get, you know, a ride with you? She felt comfortable enough to ask if she could get a ride so she could go to the clinic. And I said, of course, there's room. And you know, it just trickled to the point where, you know, every single time, you know, we'd fit like maximum capacity as many women as we could.
Yeah.
Just, you know, because they didn't have other women that they could talk with. Yeah. That could give them access to getting to town, you know, to go to clinics, you know, and it's such a, you know, we just don't think of that as being this huge barrier.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote. I love that. And there's an organisation that we work with in Kenya who are nothing to do with conservation specifically. They're entirely about just about women's empowerment, but also they have a great program called Boys for Change, where they talk to boys, like teenage boys, and get them to understand both the importance of women's empowerment, of contraception, and those boys then spread things peer to peer. But you look at these kind of projects and they're just so inspirational. You just feel humbled by people, you know, with so little, you know, resources, sorting these problems out. And again, it's worth just making them think, this is stuff that people want. This is giving people stuff that they want. It's not working against people, it's working with people. And exactly what you've described, you know, is that it's doing that, which makes it such a great solution, that you're offering people something that they want.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. And I really love, I had, you know, an opportunity to hear a talk a few years ago by the Margaret Pike Trust. And I loved that they're framing everything as barriers to family planning, as
Yeah.
opposed to populations and population growth. And I think so many of us as conservationists talk about it in that framework because we're used to thinking about things within this kind of we're used to thinking about population. But for those of us that are parents, when we hear that, it kind of puts your hackles up, right? It makes you feel like if you decide to have a child, then that's it's kind of there's a negativity associated with that. And when we talk about barriers to family planning, it puts it on all of our shoulders, whether you have children or not.
And it's a very sensitive area. It's sensitive as individuals to talk about family size. It's also, it's sensitive politically. I referred to China earlier on, but there's been far worse things done to people in the name of population, forced sterilization in India, eugenics, all those kinds of things. And we are always acutely, aware population matters, about the importance of these things, about the importance of talking about choice-based solutions and that sensitivity. And we know, we were talking to some friends in the organization in the global south, and they were talking about how opponents of family planning actually use the messaging of these are Western colonialists trying to control the number of Africans or whoever it might be in order to undermine the uptake of of family planning. That narrative is actually exploited. So again, I should really have said this when you asked about how to do it. Yes, if you talk to people on abstract terms about population and the like, and if people feel like there's blame attaching to them, you're having too many kids, then they're never going to respond in that way. We think it's very important that population matters, that we are explicit. Margaret Pike's work is really interesting because they're going into communities and they're doing these kinds of things, and it's very important that they get buy-in from communities in that way. Anyone who's working on a local level does that, and that's why any work that we do is with a local partner. They come to us saying, give us money to help what we're doing. We don't say to them. But for us, it's important that we talk about population very explicitly because we don't think it should be hidden. But yes, when you're working with people, then it's very important to be sensitive in that way.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I think, are there any other last minute questions that are coming in? I know I don't want to take up too much of your time, but this is just really interesting. That's really great conversations. Let's see. Another question, if you have a minute, Alistair. Let's see. A question. Let's see. Less children for families that don't have. I think that this question is trying to get at should what strategies help people kind of understand, in your opinion, kind of working as a campaigner, like what typically has been the driving force for people wanting to have fewer children, in your opinion?
Well, again, there's I talked earlier on about circumstances that most people, if you clear away the barriers, that very important phrase that Margaret Pike used, that people will choose that. One of the reasons that in the developed world people are having smaller families is that are things like economic reasons and that sort of thing, cost of childcare, that sort of thing. But it's really interesting. There's been this recent work done, polling, looking at the reasons why people choose to go child-free, or younger people particularly are going child-free or having fewer kids. And the environment still rates pretty low, but it's going up. And climate change is certainly one of the things that people are very conscious of. Now, there's a sad negative side to that, which is people being frightened about the future, people wondering whether or not they should have kids. And obviously, I've just spoken about catastrophe and things like that, and that's a completely legitimate concern for people to have. For us at Population Matters, it's about positive messaging. It's about choice, but there isn't an easy answer on that. We certainly see sort of anecdotally, as it were, that people are talking about the environment much more in this context. But any decision about family size is a really complicated decision, you know, or it's a really automatic decision. Lots of people don't think about it all that much. You get married, you have kids. That applied to me, I have to say, you know, and so that more thoughtful approach, and it is a thing you're seeing now. There's particularly amongst younger people, those people are so important because they're moving into the generation in which they're going to, the ages in which they're going to start having kids, are much more outward thinking about the consequences of their actions, much more thinking about the future than my generation was. So I think it's an increasingly important sort of driver, but it's such a complicated area, that family size choice.
It is, but I read a statistic recently that about half of the babies born in the United States were unintentional, you know, or unplanned, you know, and,
yes,
you know, and that was astonishing to me, you know, because you don't think of there being that many barriers. There are, you know, there are barriers that still aren't being addressed, and that also gave us a lot of hope, because, you know, if we can have better planning abilities and break down these barriers, you know, then that population trajectory can change very quickly.
Absolutely. You talk about that number of women, and of course, there are 270 million women with an unmet need for family planning. It's the sort of, you know, the research and demography always focuses on women, but of course men have a need for family planning too. And it's important for obvious reasons, but men, both in terms of their responsibilities, and I refer to that program in Kenya talking about the Boys for Change thing, that you know, project that there's both an appetite amongst men. We did a really interesting blog recently actually about male contraception. And the obstacles and barriers to male contraception. Kind of what it said was the problem is, as far as the development of those goes, is, well, women are taking care of that at the moment. So why should a man worry about it? In a sense, if you're a married man, you know, obviously there's only two methods: condoms and vasectomies available to men. There are far more for women, but you know, those kinds of dynamics apply in these circumstances. But one thing always important to say is that, true globally, about half of all pregnancies are unplanned, but of course unplanned doesn't necessarily mean unwanted. You know, when a child turns up, that you know, that doesn't mean that we have you know, half the world's population of kids are not valued or appreciated. But nevertheless, yes, absolutely, people should be able to plan and have that choice available to them.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Alistair, for that really incredible presentation, and remind everyone that this talk has been recorded, and so it will be posted. I'm happy to share that link. I've also included our email address into the chat here, so you can email if you'd like that link as well, but it'll be posted on the Conservation Catalyst, Conservation Colloquy page, as well as on YouTube, and that should be posted later today. But I also want to just make a plug. If you'd like to nominate yourself or nominate someone else to present, we still have a few slots open for next year. So please reach out to us. Please join us next month, Wednesday, the 2nd of December, same time for our presentation, which we will announce in a couple weeks. So thank you again, Alistair. This has been really wonderful. You did an excellent job of just giving us the breadth of this incredibly complex situation that impacts every single living organism on this planet. So
thank you. It was really great. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you. Bye, Alistair. Thank you.